Sunday, January 20th, 1991, Father Charlie's.
Pointed for today is curiously a gospel about leadership. It is from the Gospel according to John, in the first chapter in the 35th verse. And on another day, John the Baptist was standing with two of his disciples, and looking up, he saw Jesus walking by and said, "Look, there is the Lamb of God." And the two disciples heard him speaking and followed Jesus. But Jesus, turning around and seeing them following him, said, "What are you doing? What are you looking for?" And they said to him, Teacher, Rabbi, where do you live?" And he said to them, "Come and see." And they went, and they saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him there. And it was about the 10th hour of the day, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But Andrew, the brother of Simon, was one of the two who heard John speak and followed him. And he went and looked for his brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which is interpreted Christ. And they took him to Jesus. But Jesus, looking at him, said, "You are Simon the son of John, and you will be called Cephas," which is interpreted the rock. We are all severely impacted by a crisis of conscience. And we would all like to find some way to deal with it. And the difficulty is that we don't have much help. We don't have much help from our leaders, and we don't have much help from ourselves, and we don't have much help from our education, nor from our background, nor even from our thinking processes. Because the kind of feeling that we all have is moved by something beyond thinking. And we have been expecting it all our lives. But it doesn't make it any easier when it comes. We all realize that whatever it is that's going on is affecting all of mankind very profoundly and very deeply, and there isn't anyone in the entire world who isn't involved. It is not just a little police action in the Persian Gulf, it's another world war. And we don't understand how that could be because the forces involved don't seem to justify that, and yet they do. What is this about? What it's about is that a Western, dominantly Christian, secular nation has taken on an Islamic secular nation over a crisis of leadership. And behind that secular power, taking on that secular power, lies an absolutely massive religious crisis, which neither secular power is able to deal with, although one of them at least tries to exploit it. Saddam Hussein has cast himself as the leader of a holy war against America. The situation, however, is far otherwise. As the Saudis said, the Saudis always seem to say things better than anybody. Holy war? In order to have a holy war, you have to be holy. Well, it is very obvious that Saddam Hussein is anything but holy. so that he is simply a secular leader who has the dress of a Muslim. And as I said, it pits two secular powers against one another. But underneath all of that lies another crisis of leadership. And that crisis of leadership is the religious one. Because not far beneath this strange surface lies a civil war. In fact, 2 or 3 civil wars. And these civil wars are just as confusing and upsetting as our own civil war was to us, but perhaps even more so, because this civil war tends to involve all of mankind and not just one nation. And I would have you remember that the Civil War was the most terrible war in American history as far as casualties were concerned. We lost 800,000 men on both sides. And that the battle involved was bloody to the nth degree. Everybody thought we were going to have a short war, you know, it would last a few days. It ended up lasting 4 years and costing the blood of the nation. Everybody realized that when the Battle of Antietam was fought, we were in for real trouble. And in the process, Abraham Lincoln had anything but unanimous support. Bush has a lot more support from the nation today than Abraham Lincoln ever had at any time during the Civil War. We think protests are something new. There were draft riots in New York that paralyzed the city. The trouble is, when you get into a war like this and the leaders take us somewhere, what are we fighting about? Would someone please tell me? You know? And there is never a clear answer. There wasn't a clear answer in the Civil War. We're saving the Union. Oh, really? What Union? Someone once said about the Civil War, well, you know, something very curious did happen in the Civil War. Before the Civil War, the United States was used with the plural verb. The United States are. After the Civil War, it was used with the singular verb. The United States is. Somehow, the nation's identity as a nation emerged from that conflict. We're in another identity crisis right now. Because underneath it all lies this curious confrontation with that mysterious nation of Islam. And we realize suddenly that we don't know anything about Islam. And yet, we also know that from this point forward, we are going to be locked in with Islam. And that whatever happens with this war, it is going to resolve that question. And whenever you get, and the thing is that we also understand that it's very curious that Iraq is probably the most advanced of all the secular nations in the Muslim world, in a secular fashion. It's the least religiously oriented, perhaps, of all of them. Maybe Egypt is fairly secular, but Iraq is much more secular, and much more professedly so. Iraq is an urban society with freeways, you know. And curiously, resembles an antique form of Los Angeles. But there's that religious issue. And we also realize that when this war is over, we in this country are going to be asked to provide leadership. We are going to have to first provide leadership in Iraq. We are going to have to resurrect and save the Iraqi nation, because Iraq is going to fall apart after this war, and there are going to be people in grabbing pieces of it. Why? Because Iraq is not a nation. It's an artificial composite created by Churchill after the First World War, composed of Kurds in the north and Sunnis in the middle and Shiites in the west, and all sorts of different tribes and people, which Hussein is doing what Jefferson Davis did, trying to hammer into a nation. And whatever efforts he made in that direction, and many of them were what we would call very cruel, were going to fall apart. But if Iraq falls apart, the destabilization of the entire Arab situation is going to be disastrous, absolutely. Because all of a sudden the only major force that's going to be left is Islamic fundamentalism. The United States had better get busy, and we all better get busy thinking about what we're going to do to save the Palestinians, who will become the symbol of the Arab nation. Again, the Saudis said the perfect thing, you know. Well, Arabs? Who are they? The existence of Arabs as a nation is something that has only occurred to the Arabs recently. The Arab nation is as composite as it can possibly be, made up of hundreds of races and dialects and people. It has only one thing in common: its religion, and a culture that is pieced together from that religion. But that one thing is very big, because Islam never heard of the separation of church and state, you understand. And the union of church and state is the fact of life in that entire world. Another thing that I would bring forward for you to understand is monumental cruelty in a physical sense. That this cruelty is a part of the character of the peoples of that part of the world, in a way that absolutely staggers us. It's forthright and quite direct. I can cite to you example after example, and there's nothing new about it. We look in the Bible and we see a few evidences of that, quite a few. If one reads the Old Testament, one must be shocked, because the Old Testament brings you directly into contact with the fact that Semitic doesn't mean Jewish. It means Arab as well as Jewish. Suddenly the word anti-Semitic has to be defined otherwise than we have defined it. It doesn't mean anti-Jewish. It means anti-Semitic, which is a whole different story. The Arabs are just as Semitic as the Jews, after all. And the cruelties that appear in the Old Testament are cruelties of what I might call the Semitic world. Don't have to read very far in the Old Testament to come across them. Jephthah sacrificing his daughter, blood sacrifice. The children of Israel capturing the city of Shiloh and castrating all the men in it. I don't want to go on with the gory details. I mean, it just the Old Testament, as one governor in California said, is the most obscene book I ever read. I'm not going to tell you the stories I could tell you about just how much cruelty there is here, in the way of slaughter, castration, or rape, violence of every kind. And it's normal fare in Turkey, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Arabia, North Africa, but especially in the Middle East. We look at Saddam Hussein and see that he is what we would call a monster, because he has gone out and murdered personally with his own hand probably at least 1,000 people, most of them a lot of them at least, his own generals. One story is told that one general disagreed with him. He took him back into his office and took out his gun and shot him through the head. does this quite regularly, but no one is really, we say, oh, well, the people must be terribly upset by all of this. Yes, they're upset, but that's kind of the way things go in those countries. It happens in Syria as well, you know. The president of Syria just killed every person in a town of 10,000 people on one occasion, you recall. If we have sadness and if we have terror, we're dealing with a problem. And the problem is, how is it that we can help people who are caught in this historical situation to find a way for a meaningful life? How is it that we can regard these people as our neighbor and our brothers? Because you see, that is what we're called to do. And that's the only way we're going to solve our problem. And it's very pragmatic and down to earth. What are the differences between these curious religions of the book? It's very interesting to see how crucial the religious question really is. In our secular world here, we've patted churches on the head and said, well, yes, that's nice. And we've relegated the religious question to something that we'd rather not talk about. And the serious questions of taking God seriously have been avoided because of the fact of how bitterly people argue when the question comes up. And the secular world has decided it's easier to avoid the subject than deal with it. That's why, but now all of a sudden, you see, that isn't going to work. What are these religions of the book? That's an Islamic phrase, by the way. In the Quran, it says there are 3 religions that are accepted as being religions of Allah, of the true God. One of them, the first, is Judaism. Second is Christianity. And the third is Islam. Now, to give you a very graphic notion of everything that I have said, the modes of conversion to Islam in the 7th century, during which the Arabs conquered at least half of the known world, were very direct. They took a leaf out of the book of Alexander the Great. And they would come into a city like Alexandria or Antioch or whatever, large or small, and they would go out and take the representatives of the 3 religions of the book and post them in 3 corners of the public square. Rabbi here, priest there, imam over here. And then they would put all the other people in the other corner. Say, we'll give you 10 minutes to join your appropriate person. Join the priest, join the rabbi, and now, after they had all segregated and gone and done that, they said, now we will give the rest of you 10 more minutes to join the imam. And anyone who doesn't is dead. They, half of the people or more would usually go over and join the imam, and they would immediately slaughter all the rest right there on the spot. That's the way they converted the world to Islam. A great number of things are involved in this attitude. If you read the Quran, you are bound to be disedified. If the Old Testament scandalizes you, the Quran will absolutely destroy you. I do not advise you to read it. The Quran is, you know, one of the greatest thing that is forbidden by Islam is that you should ever say one disparaging remark against the Quran, because if you do, they will kill you. Witness Salman Rushdie, right? The reason they have that rule is that if you ever started form criticism of the Quran, you think the Bible has problems, you should see what would happen to the Quran. It's a disaster. Now, here are these millions, hundreds of millions of people impacted with absolute loyalty to a book that cannot be defended in form criticism. Talk about a problem? Wow. And fundamentalist religion in Islam means absolute obedience to a book that can't be defended. In a secular world, at least. Talk about a problem. The attitudes that accompany the various parties must all be noticed. Because notice it's a three-part struggle, and Saddam Hussein immediately caused us to pay attention to that, didn't he, by dropping the missiles on Israel. It's a three-part struggle, not a two-part struggle. It's Jewish, and Christian, and Islamic. These are the warring factors in the world of religion. Hindus have been radicalized recently into being a warring faction, but basically they're not. The Buddhists have been radicalized into being a warring faction in Vietnam, but basically they're not. The Shinto have always had their ways of dealing with that. But the great warring religions that have attempted to convert the world by force are Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Judaism's early history was involved in the conquest and slaughter of the Canaanites, as you recall, in order to convert Palestine to the great God Yahweh, who was a war god. And Christianity has the dubious honor of leading the Crusades, if you recall, which were a vast and bloody expedition in which thousands of people were killed in the name of recapturing the holy places in the name of Jesus, onward Christian soldiers marching as to war. Shall we sing that one next? Well, then comes Islam with what I already told you about marching across North Africa and killing half of the people in the place in order to make it into a follower of the true God, Allah, of whom Muhammad is the last prophet. We have a problem. Are we sad? Are we confused? Are we mixed up? Do we know what to do? Or what kind of loyalty shall we have? Islam, curiously, a man has done a study, you might have seen it recently, on the children of these three religions, Christians, the Jews, and the Islamic. He said, the divisions are laid way back in the cradle. When you examine the children, you find out they all belong to their own religion right away, in spite of whatever else you might think. And that Jewish children are all involved in the question of righteousness. Christian children are all involved in the question of the incarnation and redemption. Islamic children are all involved in submissiveness and obedience. Now think about something. Think about that. In the Islamic world, the great religious precept is to be submissive and obedient to the Holy Quran in the name of Allah, regardless of the fact that it makes no sense whatever. The old Christian practice of teaching monks to plant cabbages upside down as a test of their obedience was borrowed from the Muslims. Oh my, such a business. Is there any remedy? No. If we help these people, will they release their cruelties on us? We're all worried about that. Every one of us is worried about it right now. I drove up to San Francisco Airport last week and observed the tightened security. If you go into the post over here, they are checking your ID at the gate of the language school. Every person that goes in has to show their driver's license. Why? Because there are hundreds of thousands of potential terrorists in our midst, or I'll blow anything up. And you put that back into this submissiveness notion and this underlying streak of cruelty, which is so obviously rampant in the Middle Eastern character, much more so even than in ours, we have something to worry about, all right? Now, don't make any mistakes about this. People are people. And we're more alike than we're different. And all the religions in the world do not really take away from the fact that most people are above the law in a very positive sense. My law professor used to say this. If most people were not above the law, there would be no law. The fact is that most people, regardless of the myth of original sin, are good. Most people want peace and love and stability and kindness, and they want to get along with their neighbor and they want to love one another. Most people are like that, regardless of the culture. That's the good news, you know. And it's just as true in Iraq and Afghanistan and Arabia as it is anywhere else. The vast majority of people, I tell you again that story that occurred to me in Berlin last summer, when I went there and experienced that extraordinary event of the wall coming down and that tremendous impact. They talk about another major stroke on the common consciousness of humanity that when that wall came down. And there, you know, in Eastern Europe, I met an Iranian. And I said to him, well, now that this wall is down, we have this wall with Iran and the Arab world. What are we going to do about that? And he said, oh, well, don't be misled. There is a way to deal with it. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, 90% of the Iranians are really friendly toward America and would like to be done with all of this business and get on with making their lives meaningful in a cooperative way. He said 10% are hostile and violent. He said, unfortunately, they have all the guns right now.
How can we stress the importance of love thy neighbor as thyself then? With all the good and bad, do we hate as much as the other people hate us? Are we afraid as much as the other people are afraid?
One little boy expressed it very well. He has a father in the Gulf, you know, and he had to say goodbye to his father. And he was put on and interviewed, and he said, what was your reaction to this event? And he said, anger. He says, I was really angry when it first happened. And then I was afraid. Now, that's pretty honest. Anger, you know. And underneath, fear. And when you see that that really is the case, the anger is brought on by the fear to begin with. And that we understand that we're all afraid.
But the love can remove the stress.
Well, you don't get to the love until you recognize that you have to deal with your fear. Because fear will block love. Fear is much more the enemy of love than hate, you know. I recall that event at Monterey Peninsula College when I was in a group of people and we were discussing fear, and everybody was going around telling how people were afraid of this and afraid of that, but no one admitted to being afraid of anything. Finally, it came around to me, and I said, well, this is a very remarkable company of people who aren't afraid of anything. As for me, I'm afraid of darn near everything. And everybody looked at me, and there was a great sigh, and then we got the truth, you see. Well, we're all very fragile, and we're scared. And when you see one another and begin to have sympathy for other people's fear because of your own, instead of anger with other people because of your own, you have begun to love one another. You know, perfect love casts out fear. Well, that's the beginning. That's why I really think that this is a time for all of us to really begin to try to do what the Muslims in San Jose suggest. You know, every time I see a group of Muslims bowing toward Mecca, I get scared. I honestly do. I saw that, was coming down from visiting up at Vacaville, and I went into a highway rest stop, and there were a bunch of Muslims bowing toward Mecca. And I went, oh, God, they're going to kill me right here. I remember when I went into the airport in London, Heathrow, and there was a 14-year-old Muslim fundamentalist all dressed in the outfit. And I looked at him, and I immediately hated him. And it took me a while to deal with the point, to get to the point where I get beyond that. And I realized it just overwhelmed me. I was so threatened, you know. So are we all. And as the Muslims in San Jose said, when they were asked, what do you want from us? They said, please, try to have some understanding of our condition. Yes? Please try to understand us. And in understanding them, yes, there are all these negatives. There are all these cruelties. There are all these religious fanaticisms to deal with. But really,